West of the Great Pyramid at Giza lies the Western Cemetery, a field of mastaba tombs where the family and officials of the pharaoh Khufu were buried. It has been surveyed and excavated for over a century. George Reisner mapped it, Hermann Juncker mapped it, and in the middle of it, one rectangle of flat sand was left blank. No tomb, no superstructure, nothing on the surface at all. In the Old Kingdom, burial ground close to the pharaoh was the most valuable ground in Egypt, and officials competed for it. Every meter of that cemetery mattered. This patch was passed over. The question was never what might be hidden there. The question was why nobody built on it. Between 2021 and 2023, a joint Japanese and Egyptian team surveyed it with radar. They found something underneath. Excavation has begun, and it still has no accepted explanation. To understand why an empty rectangle at Giza is a problem, you have to understand what the ground around it is made of. The Western Cemetery is a field of mastabas. A mastaba is a tomb with a flat roof and a rectangular body, built from limestone or mud brick, standing above the surface of the plateau. Beneath each one, cut down into the bedrock, is a vertical shaft leading to a burial chamber. The structure on top is not the tomb. The structure on top is the marker. It tells you where to dig. That is the logic of the entire cemetery, and it is the logic that generations of excavators followed. George Reisner and Hermann Juncker worked here across the early decades of the 20th century, and between them they mapped a large proportion of the known mastabas. The method was straightforward. You located the superstructure, you found the shaft, you followed it down. Where there was a marker, there was something to find. Where there was no marker, there was no reason to look. Peter der Manuelian, professor of Egyptology at Harvard, has described the vacant area plainly. It had avoided exploration precisely because of the absence of superstructures. A century of careful, systematic archaeology walked around it, not out of negligence, but because the site itself gave no signal. The cemetery had told excavators where to work, and it had not said anything about that rectangle, which leaves two possibilities, and only two. Either nothing is beneath it, and the ancient Egyptians left a gap in the most contested burial ground in the kingdom for no reason, or something is beneath it, and it was deliberately left unmarked. Between 2021 and 2023, a joint research team decided to test which. The survey was led by Motoyuki Sato of Tohoku University, an expert in electromagnetic sensing, working with Higashi Nippon International University and Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics in Helwan. They brought two instruments, and neither of them required removing a single stone. The first was ground-penetrating radar. The principle is simple. The instrument sends a pulse of radio energy down into the ground and then listens for what comes back. When the pulse crosses a boundary between two materials of different density, part of it reflects. Sand returns one signature, limestone returns another. An empty space returns something different again. Drag the instrument across the surface in overlapping lines, record every echo, and the buried shapes assemble themselves out of the timing of the returns. The second was electrical resistivity tomography. It works on a different property entirely. Current is passed into the ground through electrodes, and the instrument measures how strongly the material resists it. Solid, damp rock conducts. Voids and dry fill do not. The team laid out 9 parallel survey lines, each measured with 48 electrodes spaced 2 meters apart. And there was a practical problem in the desert that tells you something about the conditions they were working in. Dry sand resists electricity so strongly that the measurement barely functions. So the team watered the electrodes. They poured water into the sand at Giza in order to hear what the current would say. 2 instruments, 2 independent physical principles, 1 patch of ground. If both returned nothing, the rectangle was simply empty and the question closed. This was not a hunt for a lost tomb. It was a survey of the one place at Giza where a tomb should have been and was not. Both instruments returned something. The ground-penetrating radar imaged a structure lying just below the surface, and its shape was the first thing that mattered. It was an L. Not an approximate bend, not a smear in the data that could be read as a corner if you wanted to see one. A clearly defined L-shaped form in the horizontal plane, roughly 10 meters by 15 meters, sitting between 0.5 meter and 2 meters beneath the desert surface. It had been there, unmarked and unsuspected, the entire time that archaeologists were working the tombs around it. The radar showed something else about it. The structure was filled with sand, mixed with gravel. It had been backfilled. That word does a great deal of work, so it is worth slowing down on. A structure that is backfilled is a structure that was open and then closed. Sand does not accumulate inside a cut in the bedrock in a neat, contained volume that holds the shape of the cut. Someone excavated that space. Then someone filled it in. Two separate decisions made by two separate acts of labor, separated by however much time passed between them. The fill is not the absence of a structure. The fill is evidence that a structure existed and that it was deliberately sealed. Sato has been direct about the shape. He has stated that the L shape cannot be created in natural geological structures. The geometry is too sharp. Bedrock fractures, sand settles, water cuts channels, but none of those processes produce a clean right angle 10 meters on a side and then pack it with graded fill. Then the resistivity survey looked deeper, and this is where the find stopped being an unmarked feature and became something else. Below the L, the electrical measurements revealed a second anomaly. It sits between roughly 3.5 meters and 10 meters beneath the surface, and it covers an area of about 10 meters by 10 meters. It registered as highly resistive. The current, pushed through the ground, struggled to cross it. Consider what that means physically. Solid limestone bedrock, the material that makes up the plateau, conducts current in a particular and predictable way. Something 10 meters down is not conducting like limestone, it is resisting. The materials that behave that way are air and dry loose fill. The researchers say the space could be empty, or it could be packed with sand and gravel. From the data they had, they could not tell which. And they said so. In the study published in the journal Archaeological Prospection in 2024, the team wrote that from the survey results, they could not determine the material causing the anomaly, but that it may be a large subsurface archaeological structure. They did not name it. They did not call it a tomb, and the paper does not claim a tomb has been found. What they wrote was that the anomalies point to the possibility of archaeological remains, and that it was important they be promptly excavated to establish their purpose. They offered one interpretation, and only one, and they hedged it. The L-shaped structure, they suggested, may have been an entrance to the deeper structure. 10 meters of resistant ground with a sealed right-angled cut sitting directly on top of it in the one rectangle of the western cemetery that nobody built on. An entrance is not a chamber. An entrance is a question about what it opens into. If the western cemetery anomaly stood alone, it would be an isolated puzzle. It does not stand alone. To understand how unresolved Giza actually is, you have to leave the cemetery and go into the pyramid itself, where 3 separate spaces are confirmed, documented, published in the world's leading scientific journals, and explained by nobody. Begin beneath. Cut into the bedrock, roughly 30 meters below the base of the Great Pyramid, is a chamber. It was reached by the descending corridor, hewn down through the living rock of the plateau, and when you arrive at it, you find that the walls are rough, the floor is uneven, and the work simply stops. It is unfinished. Someone began cutting a chamber under the largest stone structure ever built by human hands, and then abandoned it partway through. That is not a mystery of engineering. It is a mystery of intention. No text from the Fourth Dynasty explains why the work started, and none explains why it stopped. Then go up. In 2017, a team led by Kunihiro Morishima of Nagoya University published a paper in the journal Nature reporting the discovery of a void inside the Great Pyramid. It sits above the Grand Gallery. It has a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery itself, and a minimum length of 30 meters. They called it the Big Void, and they called it that deliberately, because they refused to call it anything more specific. The method they used deserves explanation because it is why nobody can dismiss the result. Cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere constantly and produce muons, subatomic particles that rain down on every square meter of the Earth's surface without interruption. Muons pass through stone, but they are absorbed as they go, and they are absorbed more heavily by dense rock than by empty air. Place detectors inside the pyramid wait and count. Where more muons arrive than the solid mass would allow, there is a void above you. The pyramid is not touched. Nothing is drilled. The particles do the surveying, and the empty space draws itself out of the counting. 9 years later, the Big Void has no agreed identity. Because its exact layout and function remain unknown, the researchers have been cautious about using architectural words for it at all. Some scholars have proposed it is not a room, but a structural relieving space, a gap left to distribute the weight of the masonry above the Grand Gallery, and that model remains consistent with the muon data. It remains consistent because the muon data cannot yet distinguish between the two. 30 meters of confirmed nothing, sitting inside the most measured building on Earth, and the field cannot tell you whether it is a chamber or a construction feature. The third space they did see. Behind the chevron blocks on the north face, muon imaging by Sebastian Procureur, Kunihiro Morishima, and their colleagues revealed a corridor-shaped structure. Their results, published in Nature Communications in 2023, described it as about 9 meters long, with a section of roughly 2 meters by 2 meters. On the 24th of February 2023, using high-frequency ground-penetrating radar, the team located an opening in a joint behind the lower chevron blocks and passed an endoscope 5 millimeters in diameter through the gap. They looked inside. It is real, and what it was for, and what the chevron above it was for, are still open questions. 3 spaces, all confirmed, all published, none explained. None of that is what most people heard about Giza in 2025. What they heard about was a city. In March of that year, in Bologna, a presentation was delivered to an audience of roughly 1,000 people and streamed live. It was called the Khafra Research Project. The presenters were Corrado Malanga of the University of Pisa, Filippo Biondi, described as linked to the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and Armando May. What they announced, if it were true, would be one of the largest archaeological discoveries ever made. The claim should be stated plainly because it is worth knowing exactly what was said. They described 8 vertical shafts descending beneath the pyramid of Khafra, surrounded by spiraling pathways, reaching depths of around 2 kilometers. They said those shafts connected to 2 enormous cube-shaped structures, each roughly 90 meters on a side. They described a water system more than 600 meters down. Malanga said the team had found what could only be described as a true underground city. The method, they said, was a proprietary technique for interpreting synthetic aperture radar data gathered from satellites. The story traveled immediately. It was carried by InfoWars, by Joe Rogan, by Piers Morgan. The archaeologist Flint Dibble observed that the claims landed on a public already primed for them by decades of stories about hidden chambers beneath the pyramids. Now the corrections, and they need to be taken one at a time. The 2025 claims have not been peer-reviewed. They were not published in a journal and submitted to specialists who could test the processing. They were announced at a press conference. No drilling, no excavation, and no independent field survey has confirmed any of the structures. Not one shaft, not one chamber. Many specialists have said the claim goes well beyond what satellite radar can reliably show, and that is the central technical objection, not a matter of opinion about who is allowed to make discoveries. The image that spread furthest in support of the claim, a dramatic cross-section showing the shafts and the cubes descending beneath the pyramid, was uploaded to an artificial intelligence detection platform. It returned a 99.9% likelihood that the picture had been generated by artificial intelligence. The most widely shared piece of evidence for the underground city was not evidence at all. It was an illustration. It is important to be fair about the people involved, because the point here is not that they are frauds. Biondi and Malanga did publish a peer-reviewed paper in 2022 in the journal Remote Sensing, applying synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography to the internal structure of the Great Pyramid. They are not unpublished outsiders shouting from nowhere. Malanga's separate and well-documented interest in books about alien abduction is a matter of public record, and readers can weigh that as they see fit. But it is not the reason the claim fails. The claim fails for a narrower and more serious reason. There is no way to test it. It arrived as a conclusion rather than as a measurement, with no data set opened to independent processing, no field verification, and no borehole. And the thing about a 2-kilometer shaft is that it is not a subtle target. If it exists, it is findable. Nobody has been permitted or has managed to find it. This is not a case of experts refusing to look. It is a case of a claim that has not yet been made testable. Put the two teams side by side, and the difference between them is not a difference of confidence. It is a difference of method. Motoyuki Sato's team found a 10-meter anomaly beneath the Western Cemetery and wrote in print that they could not determine the material causing it. They wrote that it may be a large subsurface archaeological structure. They did not claim a tomb had been found, and the paper repeatedly stresses the limits of what the measurements can support. Their conclusion was not an announcement. Their conclusion was a request. Excavate it and establish what it is. The Khufu research project found a 2-kilometer city and named it. One of those claims tells you exactly what would prove it wrong. Dig, and if there is nothing there, the interpretation collapses. The other does not, because there is no realistic prospect of sinking a shaft 2 kilometers into the Giza plateau, and until someone does, the claim floats permanently out of reach of the evidence. That is the whole distinction, and it is the distinction that separates archaeology from assertion. The tools themselves explain why restraint is not timidity here. Every instrument used at Giza comes with a hard physical ceiling, and the researchers who use them state those ceilings openly. Ground-penetrating radar loses resolution with depth. The pulse weakens as it travels, and dry sand and limestone absorb it. In practice, at Giza, it reads the top few meters of ground with real clarity, and then it goes blind. It does not see kilometers. It cannot see kilometers. The physics does not permit it. Electrical resistivity tomography reaches deeper, but it trades detail for that reach. It tells you that something down there resists current differently from the rock around it. It does not tell you what that something is. That is precisely why Sato's team could report a highly resistive anomaly and in the same paper admit they could not identify the material producing it. The instrument had said everything it was capable of saying. Muography reaches further still, but only because the pyramid is a mountain of stone standing under a permanent rain of particles. It needs months of exposure. It resolves shape and volume. It does not resolve contents, which is exactly why the Big Void, 9 years after it was confirmed in Nature, still has no name. 3 instruments, 3 sets of limits, 3 teams who publish those limits alongside their findings. That is what a real detection looks like. It looks smaller than you want it to, and it comes with an honest account of what it cannot show you. The response from the Egyptian side deserves a fair hearing too. Zahi Hawass, the former Minister of Antiquities, stated that no radar devices or modern technologies had actually been used on the ground to detect the alleged structures beneath Khafra, and dismissed the claims outright. He is right about the absence of field verification. But Hawass has also been publicly skeptical of findings that later proved sound, and skepticism from authority is a posture, not a verdict. It settles nothing on its own. What settles things is evidence. And there is a clean example of that from the same plateau in living memory. When the Scan Pyramids team believed there was a corridor behind the chevrons on the north face, they did not hold a press conference. They presented their results to a scientific committee headed by Hawass. Then they threaded a 5mm endoscope through a joint in the stone and showed him the inside of it. So, return to the rectangle. It is no longer empty. The survey that Motoyuki Sato's team completed in 2023 ended with a recommendation, and the recommendation was acted on. Excavation of the site has begun. The patch of flat sand that a century of archaeology walked past, because there was nothing standing on it to justify the digging, is now open ground with trenches cut into it. And the work has already produced something that nobody was looking for. Reports presented in 2025 and 2026 by members of the Japanese and Egyptian team describe that once vacant stretch beginning to yield, including what may be an ancient processional road. A road is not a tomb. A road is a route. It implies movement across that ground in an organized and repeated way, in a place where the surface had suggested nothing was happening at all. But the anomaly itself has not been resolved. As of now, no definitive explanation has emerged for the L-shaped structure or for the resistive volume beneath it since the study was published. The excavation is proceeding. The shape still has no name, which leaves the ledger open, and it is worth reading the whole of it in one place, because when the entries are set side by side, the scale of what is unexplained at Giza becomes difficult to argue with. A chamber cut 30 meters down into the bedrock beneath the Great Pyramid, rough-walled and abandoned partway through with no surviving text to say why the cutting began or why it stopped. A void above the Grand Gallery with a minimum length of 30 meters, confirmed in Nature in 2017, and still, 9 years later, without an agreed identity. The researchers will not call it a chamber. They will not call it a relieving space. The data does not permit either word, so they have not used them. A corridor 9 meters long behind the chevron blocks on the north face, seen directly through a 5mm endoscope, real beyond any dispute and functionally unexplained. An L-shaped cut in the western cemetery, backfilled deliberately, sitting on top of 10 meters of ground that resists electricity in a way solid limestone does not. 4 spaces, every one of them confirmed by instruments whose limits were published alongside the results, not one of them explained. And the honest work continues in the direction the loud claim pointed. The SkyDP collaboration is building muon telescopes to scan the Pyramid of Khafra from multiple viewpoints, including from inside the King's Chamber and from outside the structure itself. That is the correct way to answer the question the Khafra Research Project announced it had already settled. Muons cannot be argued with, they cannot be processed into a preferred shape, and they cost nothing but patience. If there is anything of significance under Khafra, that is the method that will find it, and it will find it whether or not anyone wanted it found. Which returns us to the reversal that sits at the center of this entire story, and it is worth stating flatly. The loudest claim ever made about the Giza Plateau produced a picture that an artificial intelligence detector flagged at 99.9%, and it produced no data anyone can test. The quietest survey ever run on the plateau produced a 10-meter volume that nobody can identify, and it is being dug out of the ground right now. The real mystery was never 2 kilometers down. It is 2 meters down, and it has been there the entire time. The sand is off the L shape. The trenches are open in a rectangle of ground that 100 years of excavation walked past, because there was nothing standing on the surface to say that anything was underneath. Somewhere below it is a volume that resists electricity in a way solid limestone does not, and the people who found it have written, in print, that they cannot yet tell you what it is. 30 meters of confirmed empty air still sits above the Grand Gallery with no name. A corridor 9 meters long sits behind the chevrons on the north face with no known purpose. A chamber cut into bedrock beneath the largest stone structure ever built by human hands was abandoned unfinished, and nobody can say why. The instruments are still running. The excavation is still open. The explanation has not arrived.